A major but lesser-known 2024 ruling about how suspects abroad are brought to this country to face local justice is now heaping extra pressure on the National Prosecuting Authority to act, whilst adding further anxiety over a perceived lack of accountability for wrongdoing in South Africa today.
There was a guy called Jonathan Schultz who was living in America from about 2019, and he was accused of involvement in the theft and sale of unwrought metals. And a number of his co-accused in that matter were arrested, and he would then, during that trial, is alerted to the fact that the NPA intends to seek his extradition on these charges. He then mounts a legal challenge where, among other things, he argues that the NPA does not have the legal power to seek his extradition, that that request needs to be made by the Minister of Justice.
This is specialist legal journalist Karyn Maughan demystifying the effects that a 2024 court judgment is now having on other cases too, including the 2023 murders of rapper Keenan aka Forbes and Tabelo Tibbs Motswane. Later in the show, former EFF turned MKP politician Floyd Shivambu says he's consulting the possibility of starting a new party, but won't resign from the MKP just yet. And finally, Kyalami racetrack solidifies plans to jumpstart to Formula One status.
To stay tuned to The Lead for every edition, hit the follow and subscribe buttons on our Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels.
You'll want to stay tuned until the end of the show to hear your voice notes. If you'd like to engage us on this episode's topics to be heard in our next edition, you can send your thoughts and opinions to our official The Lead WhatsApp line. That number is 072 562 3179. My name's Graham Robenheimer. It's Thursday. Let's chat all this and more right here on The Lead on News 24. The way this country's prosecutors go about extraditing the criminally accused from another country to face justice in a local court is currently under intense scrutiny. The crux of the matter is that last year the Supreme Court of Appeal ruled in one particular case that only South Africa's Justice Minister and not the National Prosecuting Authority is thus allowed to make extradition requests. This effectively allowed the former personal assistant to ex-Free State Premier Ace Magashule to argue her way to walking free in the so-called asbestos scam tender trial. And now this SCA ruling may affect nearly 90 other extradition matters. Our resident legal journalist, Karyn Maughan, joins me now from our Johannesburg studios to try and make sense of it all. Karyn, welcome back to The Lead.
Thank you for having me.
Anytime. I want us to go through this step by step because, believe it or not, in our last edition, we had one or two listeners sitting in voice notes at the end, still feeling a little confused because, of course, it is quite technical, right, to anybody to understand. Let's start first, Karyn, with and school me here on this SCA ruling that set this new judicial precedent, if you will. What is this case and what does that case say?
Well, essentially what had happened was there was a guy called Jonathan Schultz who was living in America from about 2019, and he was accused of involvement in the theft and sale of unwrought metals. And a number of his co-accused in that matter were arrested, and he would then, during that trial, is alerted to the fact that the NPA intends to seek his extradition on these charges. He then mounts a legal challenge where, among other things, he argues that the NPA does not have the legal power to seek his extradition, that that request needs to be made by the Minister of Justice. Now, the NPA wins that case in the High Court, but it comes before the Supreme Court of Appeal, and they agree with them, and they make a ruling that says that it's the Minister of Justice that ultimately has the legal responsibility, the legal power, Graham, to seek the extradition of an accused person from another country.
Now enter, Karyn, of course, the sort of entry point for this entire discussion, because let's be frank, that particular SCA ruling didn't really reach the sort of major headlines of the day, although important in itself and critical to what comes next. So how did this ruling allow former Magashule PA Morwadi Cholota to walk free? Of course, we've done a whole podcast on this, and if you want to understand the merits more of the asbestos scam tender trial, you can listen to our previous shows, because she essentially argued that the NPA should have known about this SCA ruling because it came before this extradition request of her bringing her back from the United States to South Africa to stand as an accused in that trial. And that's sort of how the timeline goes, right?
What had happened was, you're right. I mean, our colleague Bernadette did some very excellent reporting on the implications of the Schultz ruling and particularly focusing on the National Prosecuting Authority's somewhat bizarre decision to file an appeal 4 months late and then withdraw it and then reinstate it subsequent to that, once I think they realized the implications of what they were doing. But essentially what happened was Morwadi Cholota had done a very headline-grabbing special plea in which he makes allegations of several abuses against the state and essentially said it gave, false evidence in relation to seeking her extradition, that she was subjected to what she described as apartheid-era tactics in the Constitutional Court, that essentially she was targeted for prosecution because she didn't want to give, on her version, false evidence against Ace Magashule. And Graham, of course, we know that she's a pivotal witness because on the state's version, she's the person that solicited what they said were bribes for Magashule from murdered businessman Igo Pambeni. So she, at the tail end of that case, and the state makes this point in its attempts to appeal this ruling, her lawyers then say, but in any event, this extradition, her extradition from the United States was unlawful based on the Schultz ruling, which was given in May 2024. Of course, the final order for Cholota to be extradited was given by an American court about, sort of 2 months later, few weeks later. And Judge Philip Loebscher, is a Free State High Court in Bloemfontein judge who's presiding over the asbestos case, says, you know what, you had this time to do something about it, but because this is an SCA ruling, the Schultz ruling is an SCA ruling, the SCA sets the precedent here. I'm a lower court, I'm a high court judge. I don't have the legal ability to not take that precedent on board. And as a result, I'm going to find that Morwadi Cholota's extradition was unlawful. And I'm going to say that this court doesn't have jurisdiction to hear the case against her. And as he said to her at the end of that case, you are now free to go.
What bearing does this precedent now have on the Keenan, aka Forbes, and Tabelo Tibbs Matswane murder trial? We're now seeing that there's two co-murder accused in this particular case. Their legal team sort of eyed what had happened in the asbestos scam tender trial, and they're going, this looks like we've got a nice opening in our particular case because the two accused here had to be brought back from the Kingdom of Eswatini. Is that right?
Well, they're still in Eswatini because they had been fighting this extradition very hard. And what I think, we're going to get into this later on, but one of the most important things here is that in the NPA's subsequently withdrawn application to challenge the Schultz ruling on the merits, to say that we think the ACA got it wrong, that the NPA should be allowed to seek extraditions. Andrew Chalke, who's the deputy public, the DPP of Joburg, said that there were 89 extraditions that, based on the Schultz precedent, could fall to be set aside. Now, we know that Schultz's lawyers have written letters to the NPA and said, listen, what are you talking about? You haven't raised this kind of issue in this case, but which cases are you specifically talking about? To this date, we don't know. We know that Parliament is looking into this, whether that information comes up in Parliament, but the NPA has been very reluctant to identify the specific cases that are actually, in their view, affected by the Schultz ruling. But the brothers, the Indande brothers, who are accused of quite crucial involvement in the murder of AKA and his friend Tibbs, they essentially are saying that they regard the Schultz ruling and the Cholota ruling, where the judge said, I have no choice but to accept this as a precedent, will potentially be, they regard as crucial to their clients, the legality of their clients' extradition, because they are adamant that the request that they received for these men's extradition were made by the NPA, that they have affidavits where the prosecutor said, I am authorized to seek this extradition request. And they say within the documentation that they've received, there is no indication that the then Justice Minister Ronald Lamola was in any way, shape, or form involved in that extradition. And ergo, he did not request the extradition, and they believe they would then have grounds to take whatever legal action they do. So they have the option, of course, raising this in the extradition in Eswatini and then facing the prospect that potentially the NPA then, or the Justice Ministry then brings a separate application for an extradition. You know, we don't know what the bounds would be within that. If they could then argue, well, this is res judicata, you can't bring another application, it's unfair to us. Or, and I think that this may be more potentially likely, they potentially consider abandoning their appeal against the extradition and do what Charlotta did, raise a special plea and say, this court doesn't have jurisdiction to try us because look at Schultz, look at the Charlotta case. You have been, the NPA has been denied an appeal by Judge Philip Loebscher that we know we're going to petition, but that precedent stands and we fit within the same factual matrix. This should apply to us too.
But of course, Karyn, Parliament was a focal point for all things NPA and justice in this country this week. Of course, the Justice Portfolio Committee had met. Some key MPs within that committee were waiting for NPA head Shamila Batoya, as well as the Justice Minister Mamoloko Kobai, to appear to account for the state of the NPA. And of course, all of these recent rulings that haven't gone prosecutors' way have been sort of the key concern for EFF and MKP MPs. But I thought this quite interesting is that the Justice Ministers maintained that this SEA Schultz ruling did not affect, according to her, the Indande brothers' extradition, and that she claims that there is a letter that was sent by her predecessor, Ronald Lamola, that had been sent to the Eswatini authorities already. Have you seen that? Is that true or not?
Well, the lawyers are saying they haven't got that. And I think it's quite interesting. I found a press release that was done by the Justice Department where they said Lamola had transmitted a request, which is somewhat different. You know, this is legal nerd stuff. Sorry, guys, to requested. So we would have to see what that documentation involves. I mean, the minister said to me in an exclusive interview for News 24, that she did not believe, she had been briefed that this case was not affected. But I mean, I have a horrible apprehension that this Schultz ruling is going to bring about a number of other potential applications where people are going to contest what exactly it means for the Justice Minister to request the extradition. Because certainly in terms of the Indande brothers, the affidavit that was filed, the evidence that was presented was all done by the NPA. The minister is saying that that's completely normal, that it's not for the minister to get involved in extraditions, that they have an oversight role. This is an executive role. But I have an apprehension that that's going to be a site of contestation. And of course, we know, Graham, that the NPA is attempting to try and challenge the issue of retrospectivity of the Schultz decision in the Constitutional Court. But, you know, after withdrawing that appeal and then subsequently trying to reinstate it and saying, you know, this case has potentially very adverse implications for all these extradition matters. And we would obviously like to apply for a situation where the Schultz ruling does not apply to any extradition that is sought before it was granted. Now, if they get an order to that effect, which is, we don't know the likelihood of that, then that would apply to Charlotta, and it would certainly apply to the Indamani brothers and anyone else who falls within that particular basket of the alleged 89 extraditions that are affected by this.
Yeah, because you kind of preempt my next question, because you do sort of allude that obviously the NPA is, I mean, obviously they're trying to internally figure this all out, right? Because it is an unusual situation to be in. Do we know, just sort of give it to me straight, where do we sit in terms of the SEA case and that precedent going forward in terms of challenging the root of that? Where are we on that process, if at all?
So this is the difficulty for the NPA, right? So it wants to bring an appeal to essentially say, this ruling shouldn't apply to all these other extraditions. We've spent hundreds of millions of rands. These are, I mean, my understanding from the people that I've spoken to within the NPA is that a large chunk of these cases involve murders. You know, I mean, I understand that there was a rape case amongst them, kidnapping, but you don't seek extraditions in matters that aren't extremely serious. There's a lot of corruption. We know, for instance, that this case affects one of Brian Hlongwa, the former MEC's co-accused who's in the UK. He's used Schultz to successfully challenge his extradition. Sure. So it's very, very serious cases. But when this Schultz matter was being mounted, it doesn't seem like there was an awareness of what the implications would be if Schultz succeeded. And so as a result, we didn't see the NPA either in the High Court or in the SCA saying, look, in the event that the court finds in the favor, you know, because there was legal precedent around this issue of the justice minister seeking extraditions, if you find that that precedent applies and you say that this needs to be the case, you know, we need to give an order that there will this ruling will not be retrospective on all the extraditions that have been made prior to it being granted. But no order to that effect was made. And so now they sit with this morass of uncertainty over cases that involve horrific murders, rapes, kidnappings, corruption. And we've only very much touched the tip of the iceberg because we don't know at this point which other matters are involved. I mean, AKA is obviously a very high profile one, but there are a lot of other ones. And so now it really becomes an issue of, does the Constitutional Court then say, well, we understand that this was never raised before in any other court, but we're going to step in and hear an issue on retrospectivity, an argument you never made. We're going to intervene and listen to that. Schultz's lawyers have filed documents at the Constitutional Court and letters where they say you can't do that. Like you just don't have the ability to do that. So how do they then, you know, I would be surprised, maybe stranger things have happened if the Con Court decided that they were going to hear that appeal. But if the Con Court doesn't hear the appeal, Graham, what's the second step? I mean, Schultz's lawyers have suggested that the NPA can go to the High Court and seek an order, bring a separate application. But all the time, the clock is ticking. All the time, you've got people whose trials are being delayed, who can turn around and say, this is unreasonable. We have rights as accused persons. You can't do this to us. And so this whole thing has the potential to implode in a way that I think should cause real, and I understand it is causing real alarm for the NPA, but should cause alarm for ordinary South Africans as well, because it has really damaging implications for the administration of justice.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Karyn, and you can smack me at the end of the you could smack me at the end of the conversation. But the Guptas, where does it leave them? Because from my simple recollection, I remember the former Justice Minister Ronald Lamola being very keenly involved in obviously trying to bring the brothers to this country. Where do we stand now in relation to all of this?
So interestingly enough, of course, we know that Shamila Batoy in Parliament was very critical of, you know, and so is Andrea Johnson, the head of IDAC, been very critical about how the Dubai appeal court dealt with that extradition application. We know that they turned it down, and the NPA to this day says they can't understand why that was. Ronald Lamola was involved in that extradition request. So, you know, Kubaya's come out, the minister's come out and said, you know, he signed off on that. There's no hint that there was anything untoward in that. But in any event, they will now have to bring a fresh extradition application, which they say they're going to do. And interestingly enough, I mean, they're in a much stronger position. And, you know, because the case that one of the cases that had been invalidated, that they were being sought on, which is, of course, the 24.9 New Lane case, has now been reinstated. Effectively, there's going to be a retrial in the SCA. The other case was the Freda Dairy Project scam, was struck off the roll, but there are indications that the NPA intend to re-enroll it. We don't know in this latest extradition case if IDAC has been looking at other cases that the Guptas can stand trial on, because one of what our listeners might not be aware of is that when someone seeks your extradition from another country, they can only try you on the cases that they get your extradition on. They can't bring you back to the country and then be like, oh, we're going to smack you with X, Y, Z. You can only legally be tried on those cases. So we're going to see if the NPA is going to lodge that extradition request. First of all, they're going to have to find out where the Guptas are. We don't know for sure that they're still in Dubai. They may be in India. They've been moving around. I think there was at one stage, I had a colleague in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, one of the stans, informed me that they had been doing activities there. So they would have to find the country there where they were. They would have to get a red notice for them. They would again have to get them arrested. And then they would have to convince the legal system and the political functionaries within that environment that indeed they had a case and that they could bring it against them. But what will, of course, complicate that extradition application, and we know the Guptas have done this in the past, is the Guptas are very likely to point to some of the adverse, rulings and the handling of some of those cases, particularly Freda with the long delays and the et cetera, and say, well, we don't believe we're going to get a fair trial. This is political. They've made those arguments in the past. Ultimately, that wasn't the basis upon which the Dubai appeal court found in their favor. It was technical issues. But, it's all very up in the air as to whether that will succeed given the previous unsuccessful efforts by the NPA.
So frustrating. It's just so frustrating.
Very frustrating.
But of course, the system is there to protect the innocent, right? At the same time. And this frustration was, of course, echoed by the EFF and MKP MPs in Parliament this week, who, of course, were doing their respective jobs by asking for accountability. But they went even further and asked for the head of Shamila Batohi as she came to account for her department's successes and failures. And of course, the Justice Minister was there as well. But I thought quite interesting out of all of this, you have the ACDP MP Steve Swart. He's been there forever and ever, amen. And he was going, I don't want Batohi gone. Yes, she got a very difficult, we're calling it a department or the NPA to look after the state capture years. And, the ACDP supports her view that there should be a commission of inquiry into the systemic issues, as she puts it, within the country's criminal justice system today.
Well, Robert Nugent, the judge who presided over the SARS inquiry, he gave us an exclusive interview where he said he fundamentally believed that a kind of SARS-type inquiry into the NPA, not necessarily the criminal justice system, would be very helpful. We know, of course, that Zondo, the state capture inquiry, had initially been looking at the dysfunction with the NPA because we did see horrendously politically motivated prosecutions, subsequently abandoned against Pravin Gordhan. But, people like Johan van Lochenberg, the so-called SARS rogue unit, were put on trial. That case collapsed. Glynis Breitenbach, now DA MP, was put on trial and acquitted over, her possession of an NPA laptop. And she fundamentally maintained it was because of her work in trying to push for the prosecution of Jacob Zuma's, intelligence police chief, Richard Mdluli, who, of course, now I think is in prison or on his way to it. And Anwar Dramat, the former head of the Hawks, also put on trial. So we have to remember that we came from a very, very dark season with the NPA, where there was manifestly politically motivated prosecutions. And I think, there are some hard questions that need to be answered by the political functionaries in this, not least of all the president, who has been sitting on Shamila Batohi's application for an inquiry and suspension of the DPP, Andrew Chauke, of course, made that controversial decision to drop charges against Zizi Kodwa, and is indeed the main deponent in the extradition appeal. Who's saying that there's these 89 cases that fall to be set aside. And, I've spoken to Ramaphosa's spokesperson. There's no move on that. And so, we also see with the minister who I interviewed that she was very adamant that the NPA pursuing the Schultz appeal would, in her mind, amount to, bitter litigation between the NPA and the Justice Department. But I think that might have been a mischaracterization that was not properly informed by legal advice and not properly informed by a legal strategy to deal with the impacts that this would have, which is now happened to Charlotta, happened in the Cholongwa related matter, potentially could, I shudder to even imagine what will happen if the public sees AKA's accused killers walking away. But, these are the cases that we know about. And so in my mind, there are cases that have been withdrawn. We'll have to see. There's a new lane retrial, et cetera, et cetera. The NPA will have to.
That's a glimmer of hope there in itself.
Yes. But that being said, the Schultz and the Omatosa matters were both cases where there were clear alarm bells raised and no one was listening. And I think that there does need to be a degree of political accountability for that. Maybe not fully from Shamila Batoye herself, but also from the Justice Ministry and from President Cyril Ramaphosa in terms of their inaction and their ability to work together with the NPA to preempt what now appears to be an incredible crisis moment for the state and for the administration of justice.
Crisis moment, Karyn, but I thought I'd give this last question. Maybe you can give us some positivity in like a 1 minute response here in a nutshell. What would you say to my uncle who's putting on his fire on a Saturday afternoon and he's sipping his whiskey and he's very upset about the fact that there's no accountability at the end of the day, that people who were embroiled very clearly in grand scale state capture corruption that has been part of the history and tapestry of South African life and political life for stretching back into the mid 1600s all the way up until now. We've had that long list of rogues gallery in the history of this country of people who've been corrupt, but they just never face the music. What would you say?
Well, the SCA made it very clear in the New Lane judgment that they said that Acting Judge Nompumelelo Gusha had got it horribly wrong and that her own view of the state's incompetence in the investigation of that case, which was the first state capture trial, she was so blinded by her perception of the state's incompetence that she didn't take into account the evidence. And the court has actually found that there is a prima facie evidence case against all the accused in that case, who include Iqbal Sharma, include Gupta Ale, Ranika Raghavan, and they're essentially said that, she got it wrong. And they've laid out a basis, as Andrea Johnson, the head of IDAC, said, to vindicate the NPA in that case. But ordering a retrial is not the same as getting a court victory. And I think that, we're at a moment now where Shamila Batoye's term is coming to an end. There is going to be a replacement for the NPA, the head of the NPA. And it's really time, we see people like Action SA marching, where we as South Africans start saying to the authorities, you need to understand that this is not just a law enforcement issue. This is a public well-being, accountability, governance issue. And we as voters, we as South Africans, we as ordinary people want to see you doing everything you can to ensure that the NPA is supported and enabled to do its jobs, whether that includes getting rid of the bad apples and having inquiries and doing what needs to be done. We welcome the investigation into the political interference in the apartheid era prosecutions, which in many ways was the NPA's original sin.
Long overdue.
Long overdue. But this has to become a political issue where politicians do not simply get the ability to wash their hands of the NPA every time they misstep because of lack of resources, lack of capacity, and lack of political support. It's broader than just the NPA. It's a political failure altogether.
And let me just say, Karyn, very well put, by the way, so succinctly, thank you. I expected that from you, and I know you would have done it justice. Hey, look what I'm doing there. But on a very serious note, there's some apartheid-era cases that I think are still going to come out of the woodwork in future. Stay tuned, because I think there's going to be still a lot to talk about in terms of our history and where we go to next. That's Karyn Maughan, our specialist legal journalist, always doing an absolutely stellar job demystifying what it means to not only understand critical cases in our country, but also to help determine what might come of it and what might happen next. I really appreciate it and hope we get to chat again soon. I'm sure we will.
Thanks, Graham.
To our trending topic now, and a tweet, statement, or possibly even a WhatsApp may have been sufficient, but former ANC Youth League and EFF politician Floyd Shivambu thought it necessary to call the country's press to an impromptu, unsanctioned midday briefing at a Midrand hotel following his ejection as Secretary General of the Umkhonto weSizwe Party to Member of Parliament. Shivambu alleged that he was removed from this post due to a fake intelligence report claiming that he wanted to overthrow Jacob Zuma as the MKP's president. His axing at the time was officially blamed on his recent visit to controversial Malawian pastor Shepherd Bushiri, but political pundits were not buying this. Now Shivambu has announced two things at the briefing. One, that he'll never resign from the MKP, keyword resign, and two, that he's holding consultations to possibly start a new party. But here's what he had to say about the Zuma overthrow allegation.
An extremely bizarre and fake intelligence report was produced, which was claimed to be a conversation between me and some people in the African continent, where it is alleged that despite raising money to remove President Zuma, I'm also accumulating supernatural powers to make people disappear. That is the reason why we had to deal with superstitious issues as the basis of what happens, that there's apparently a head which I was going to be given to give to someone, and some people were going to die so that I can become president of Umkhonto weSizwe. That was the intelligence report, which were rejected with contempt and said that that is absolute rubbish.
Shivambu later called his former colleagues, the Red Berets, a cult that he would never rejoin. For more political coverage, check out the front page of News 24.
Are you burnt out from the week that was, but need to stay in the news loop? Every Saturday morning at 6, we release The Weekender, a quirky, in-depth look at South Africa and its people. Chock full of exclusive interviews, food, wine, playlists, and opinions, The Weekender is the ultimate segue into Saturday, right here on News 24.
And finally, it's been the talk of the local motorsport scene, for the longest time. When will Formula One finally come to Mzansi? Now, Kyalami Grand Prix circuit in Gauteng's Midrand has made a major announcement. CEO Toby Venter says the global FIA body overseeing the popular sport has accepted their plans to upgrade Kyalami to a Grade 1 course fit for Formula One races. As it stands, Kyalami only has a Grade 2 certification. It may cost up to around 180 million rand to complete the course upgrades. Our motoring editor Janine van der Post has more on this exciting development, but says perhaps hold your horses for now.
Seems as if the glimmer of hope for Formula One's return to South Africa has been reignited. But what does all the commotion at Kyalami really mean? In short, no. South Africa is not going to be added to an F1 calendar. Not just yet anyway. However, the fact that the FIA has approved the final design proposals from Kyalami means that we're taking another step closer in the right direction. The UK-based company Apex Circuit Design facilitated the upgrade process, and this too cost a pretty penny. But it means that once the upgrades have been completed, Kyalami will be the only Grade 1 circuit in Africa, and that's the highest standard required to host a Formula One event. Toby Venter became every petrolhead's hero when he saved Kyalami in 2014 when he put down 207 million rand for it at auction. In 2016, he spent more money upgrading it to Grade 2 status, and now the current circuit owner is doing everything he possibly can to make sure the facility will be ready should all the cards fall into place. The upgrades are not major and can literally be done in 3 months, but because there is an investment out of pocket and there's no imminent F1 race confirmed, and there are other events already booked at Kyalami, there's basically 3 years to get everything in order. Changes need to be made to a few turns on the track, including turn 2 and 13, which will get more runoff area. Some more gravel will be brought closer to specific corners, and others will get revised curbing. The pit lane and grid area will also need a few changes. So essentially, changes to make sure that the safety standards are met. In the event a promoter does secure an F1 event for SA, additional viewing platforms and hospitality areas will also then be needed. But the upgrades will cost between 90 and 180 million rand. But the important thing is that everyone needs to remember that even if we don't get an F1 race, it still opens the doors to many future possibilities for South Africa. So while Mr. Venter is doing everything he can, government needs to come to the party along with the promoter before we'll see an F1 race come our way.
And remember, you can catch Janine's weekly News 24 podcast, Driving with J9, on all of your favorite streaming platforms. P.S. I hope to be on soon. From the NPA to Shivambu to Formula One, well, Thursdays are always an action-packed news day here at News 24. We got quite a few voice notes and comments on our last episode of this week. It was Iran-Israel conflict explained. We got our international correspondent Philip de Wet on to help us navigate the developments coming out of the Middle East as these two countries had exchanged a series of massive missile blows in recent days. And of course, the big question had been whether or not the US under the Trump administration would then be joining the fray. Here are some of your voice notes. Let's have a listen.
But honestly, how can South Africa play a peacemaker role between Israel and Iran when it failed DRC? South Africa failed to manage the M23 rebels. What more about about ballistic missiles?
And enter into the mixture, what is happening in the Middle East, because they can't even manage their municipalities. They can't manage the health system. Oh, that is too big for South Africa to even try to give advice. They're not capable. They can't. They must first manage their own problems.
Donald Trump must go away with the Middle East because it will cause another problem. Please, that guy must not involve himself in the Middle East. Those people have enough energy and money to fix their problems.
How long did the Palestinian people going to suffer under this brutality of Israel? And America is quiet because the Israel is their friend. So many people, innocent people, are dying because of this. So Israel must stop.
After all, USA only has the nuclear bomb that can destroy Iran. So Trump must intervene. It's a must.
Yeah, good evening. How are you? Yeah, my thought on this issue is that I think the United States should not get themselves involved. Otherwise, it's going to lead to a third world war. So the best thing is for Israel to withdraw their fight against Iran because they are the first nation to attack Iran. Thank you.
The ceasefire between Israel and Iran, we can just pray about that so that it will happen. And then will the US intervene? If they do, US is a very strong country, especially with the army. And no, South Africa will never, ever be a peacemaker. There's too much politics going on in South Africa. That's why everybody is fleeing away from South Africa at this stage.
Hi, how are you? Yeah, it's Indande here. Okay, no, I think South Africa should just be neutral and be no peacemaker.
I agree with you.
A war that's been going on for decades. Even besides firing missiles, that war has been there psychologically. South Africa is a very young country. I don't think South Africa even knows how to mediate in such a volatile situation. Yes, that's my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, Israel is the baby of America. So even though America is going to take side of Israel at the end of the day, but I think because now the Republicans and the leader of Republicans, which is Donald Trump, they are not much into these war things. You know, they like to play a role of peacemakers and so forth, even though they're going to take a side a little bit. But I don't think they will be involved themselves in these war things, because the only the only party there in America, the Democrats, if it was Democrats, Iran is going to be in a very big trouble.
Well, thank you so much. It just shows you just how much debate, how much discussion is brought about this rather heated topic, and especially the question about whether or not South Africa could play peacemaker as a potential role here elicited a lot of commentary and reaction from you. So I really do appreciate it. Please keep it coming. We play all of your voice notes here on The Lead, and we love this robust discussion because it also helps us to steer to our next topics and take this show even further every single day and every single edition. So thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. Of course, if you'd like to send a WhatsApp on today's topic, that number again is 072-562-3179, and we'll go through your voice notes and pick out those for the next edition, which will be now this coming Monday. So if you do send any of the voice notes now, they'll only play out on the end of Monday's show, but they'll be there. To be reminded of that show, you can hit the follow and subscribe buttons on the Spotify, Apple, and YouTube podcast channels closer to the time. Well, that's it. Have a fantastic weekend. Cape Town's still pretty much grey and gloomy, and we hope for sunshine yet. My name's Graham Robenheimer, and so long as there's news, we'll have The Lead.